The soup was still warm at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Hillcrest Waste District, end of Meridian Road, a place the city had quietly stopped naming on maps, and Samara Cade's hands, steady, careful, unhurried, extended a tin bowl toward a woman hunched between a collapsed tire and a heap of black bags, as if she were offering it across a dining table set with fine linen. The woman's fingers, cracked and gray with dust, trembled as they reached forward. A single tear carved a clean line through the dirt on her cheek. Samara didn't look around. She didn't calculate the risk. She simply stayed, kneeling in her pressed black uniform with the white apron that smelled of the Virely kitchen, and she waited. The way you wait for someone you love to finish their meal. She had no idea she was being watched. Here is what Samara didn't know. The man standing 40 feet behind her, half hidden by a rusted corrugated wall, was not a security guard sent to catch her stealing. The man in the charcoal suit, the one whose silence could dismiss an entire household staff before breakfast, was not calculating punishment. Alaric Virely had spent 22 years being told his mother had chosen to leave. 22 years building himself into the kind of man who turned grief into granite, who bought companies the way other men bought silence, and who had not wept once since the morning he was 11 years old and found her bedroom empty. 22 years becoming powerful enough that nothing in the world could reach him. And then a maid with a soup bowl reached something no boardroom, no lawyer, no private investigator ever had. Because Alaric Virely was not watching Samara break a rule. He was watching a woman he did not yet recognize, could not yet allow himself to recognize, except bread from a stranger's hands. And somewhere in the locked chamber of his chest, something ancient and unbearable began to move. In 72 hours, everything Alaric thought he knew about his own story would be dismantled and remade. But here is what no one tells you about the moment a simple act of kindness cracks open a life built on pain. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with drama or thunder. It arrives as a bowl of soup, warm, offered without condition, at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, by a young woman who only wanted to make sure someone didn't go hungry. This is the story of what happened next. The Virely estate did not welcome people. It absorbed them. 16,000 square feet of pale stone and glass, perched at the edge of the city's wealthiest ridge, like something that had decided, long ago, that it did not need to be beautiful, only impressive. The grounds were maintained, with surgical precision. The hedges did not curve, the gravel did not shift. Even the roses along the east wall seemed to bloom on schedule, as if they had been briefed. Alaric Virely had designed it that way, not out of vanity, but out of philosophy. Disorder, in his experience, was simply weakness that hadn't yet been named. He was at his desk by 5:15 every morning, no alarm, no struggle, already 3 calls deep into the Asian markets, before the kitchen staff had finished brewing the first pot of coffee. His suits were made by a tailor in Milan who flew in twice a year and spoke very little, which Alaric appreciated. His calendar had no gaps. His instructions were given once. The staff had learned, quickly and collectively, that a second request was not a reminder, it was a judgment. No one disliked him exactly. You cannot dislike weather. Samara Cade arrived each morning at 6:45, through the side entrance on Haverford Lane, the one that opened with a keypad and closed without a sound. She was 26, though there was something in the way she moved through a room, unhurried, attentive, almost ceremonial, that made her seem both younger and older than that. She polished surfaces that were already clean. She straightened things that were only slightly off, not from anxiety, but from a quiet, almost private sense of care, as though the house deserved to be treated gently, even if its owner did not think so. She had learned early not to meet Alaric Virely's gaze directly, not because she feared him, though she respected the boundary, but because she had noticed, in the rare moments he passed through a room she was working in, that he moved through the world like a man who had trained himself not to need anything from it. Eye contact felt like an imposition he hadn't consented to, so she worked in his orbit the way smaller planets do, steady, quiet, following the rules of gravity without complaint. She needed this job, her mother's medication, the 2 younger cousins she was putting through school back home. The small, fragile architecture of her life rested on this salary, and she knew it. She carried that knowledge not as shame, but as responsibility. What no one in that house understood, what no one had thought to ask, was that Samara Cade's gentleness was not softness. It was the most disciplined thing about her. And discipline, as Alaric Virely was about to discover, can take many forms. There was a drawer in Alaric's private office that his personal assistant had been instructed, on her first day, never to open, not because it contained anything dangerous, but because it contained everything true. Inside, a folder, worn soft at the corners from handling, a child's school photograph, a boy of 11, gap-toothed with his mother's eyes, 3 private investigator reports spanning 2 decades, each one thicker than the last, each one ending in the same hollow conclusion. A single earring, gold small, shaped like a crescent moon, and at the very bottom, beneath everything else, an official document from the city's family records office, dated 22 years ago, bearing the words that had quietly governed his entire adult life. Mother Eloan Virely. Status, voluntarily departed. No forwarding address provided. Voluntarily departed. He had read those 2 words so many times that they had ceased to mean anything specific, and had become instead a kind of permanent bruise, one he no longer noticed until something pressed against it. He had started searching when he was 19, quietly, methodically, the way he did everything. The first investigator had been recommended by a university professor. The man spent 4 months and returned with a theory about a woman matching Eloan's description who had been seen boarding a bus to the coast. The lead dissolved within a week. The second investigator was better. Former law enforcement. He spent 14 months combing through records, shelter registrations, hospital admissions. He found 3 women with similar names. None of them her. He apologized when he closed the case, which Alaric found privately unbearable. He had not hired the man to apologize. The third firm was the most expensive and the most thorough, a full team operating across 2 cities for nearly 2 years. They produced a report of extraordinary detail, documenting everything Eloan Virely wasn't, every address she hadn't lived at, every record that bore her name and turned out to belong to someone else entirely. By then, Alaric was 30. He had built his first company from a rented office and a borrowed desk. He had learned that the world responded to certainty, and so he had made himself certain about everything except this, what the official report had never explained, what no investigator had ever adequately answered, was the detail that kept Alaric awake in the hours before his 5:15 alarm. His mother had left without her earrings. They had been a gift from her own mother, passed down with the specific instruction that they were never to be removed. Eloan had worn them every single day of his childhood. They sat on her nightstand the morning she disappeared, both of them as though she had simply stepped out and expected to return. A woman who chooses to leave, Alaric had long believed, takes the things she loves. She had left everything, including him. Samara first saw her on a Wednesday. She had taken the longer route home, the one that wound past the old industrial quarter, where the city's waste collection trucks made their final deposit before the weekend. She walked it sometimes when she needed air that didn't smell of furniture polish and obligation. There was something honest about that part of town. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She almost missed her entirely. The woman was tucked so far into the shadow of a collapsed lean-to, so still, so perfectly folded into the surrounding debris, that she registered first as shape rather than person. A bundle of gray cloth, a form that breast. Samara stopped. The woman's hair was long and entirely white, fanned around her shoulders like something that had once been tended and was now simply endured. Her hands rested in her lap with a strange, residual dignity, not clutching, not reaching, just resting as though some deep, trained part of her still remembered how a person was supposed to sit. She was not young, she was not well, but there was something in the architecture of her face, even beneath the weathering and the exhaustion, that made Samara stand still for longer than was comfortable. She looked, Samara thought, like someone's mother. She didn't stop that first day. She told herself it wasn't her place, that she had her own burdens balanced carefully across her shoulders, and adding to them was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had 14 people depending, in various ways, on the salary that required her to arrive each morning at 6:45 and leave each evening without incident. She told herself all of this on the walk home. She didn't believe a word of it. By Friday she was back, this time with a container of rice and stew from her own kitchen, wrapped in a cloth bag she carried without quite admitting to herself why. The woman was still there. She accepted the food with both hands and did not speak, but she looked at Samara with eyes so dark and so exhausted, and so full of a grief too large to name that Samara had to breathe through it. The way you breathe through something that costs you. She went back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. It was on the 4th visit that she made the decision she had been trying not to make. The estate kitchen produced more than it consumed. There were evening meals prepared for a household of 1, portions calibrated for guests who rarely came. Food that was disposed of with the same efficiency as everything else in Alaric Virley's world. Cleanly, quietly, without sentiment, Samara began, carefully and without announcement, to redirect some of that efficiency. She told herself it was practical. She told herself no one would notice. She told herself this was not the most reckless thing she had ever done. She was wrong on all 3 counts. It was the container that first made him suspicious. Alaric noticed things. It was not a skill he had cultivated so much as one that had simply never switched off, a low, constant hum of observation that ran beneath every meeting, every conversation, every silent walk through his own estate. He noticed the angle of a misplaced chair. He noticed when a report had been amended after printing. He noticed, 3 weeks into what Samara believed was a perfectly concealed routine, that she left the estate each Tuesday evening carrying slightly more than she arrived with. He said nothing. He watched. The following Tuesday, he left his car 2 blocks from the estate and followed on foot, at a distance that required no effort to maintain. Samara walked with purpose, unaware, the cloth bag secure in her hands. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, something mundane. A small dishonesty of the kind he had seen before, provisions redirected for personal use. A quiet arrangement with someone outside. He had expected to feel the clean, uncomplicated clarity of being right. He had not expected Meridian Road. He stopped at the rusted wall and watched. Samara was already kneeling, the tin bowl extended, her voice too low to carry. The woman on the ground reached forward with both hands and received what was offered. And Samara, still in her uniform, still in her white apron, waited with the specific, unhurried patience of someone who understood that dignity mattered more than efficiency. Alaric stood completely still. He had built an entire life on the principle that sentiment was indistinguishable from vulnerability. He had held that belief for 22 years, with the consistency of a structural wall. He held it now and felt it hold, and then felt, without warning, something shift beneath it. He looked at the woman on the ground. He looked at her hands, the way they trembled, the way they held the bowl with a care that suggested she remembered, somewhere beneath everything that had happened to her, what it meant to handle something precious. He looked at her hair, long, entirely white, spread around her shoulders. He looked at the line of her jaw, the shape of her brow, the particular way her head tilted when she accepted the food, a gesture so specific, so embedded in some locked room of his memory, that his body understood it before his mind would allow itself to. His breath left him without permission. 22 years of granite, 22 years of discipline and distance, and the daily, practiced work of not needing anything. It cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, the way old stone cracks quietly, from the inside, along a fault line that was always there. Alaric Virley took 1 step forward, then stopped, his hand pressed flat against the corrugated wall beside him. The woman looked up, and for the first time in 22 years, so did he. Samara heard him before she saw him. A footstep on gravel, deliberate, close. She turned, and the bowl nearly slipped from her hands. Alaric Virley stood at the edge of the clearing, in his charcoal suit, his pocket square still perfectly folded, his expression doing something she had never seen it do in all her months at the estate. It was doing nothing, not coldness, not calculation, nothing. The face of a man whose every carefully maintained feature had simply stopped receiving instructions. Samara rose slowly, placing herself by instinct between her employer and the woman on the ground. The way you step in front of something you want to protect, before you have thought through whether you are capable of protecting it. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his mother. Alaric's mind was doing what trained minds do under impossible pressure. It was searching, cross-referencing, demanding evidence, refusing the conclusion, even as the conclusion became undeniable. The woman before him was old in a way that 22 years of hardship compounds beyond its natural measure. She was diminished. She was weathered past recognition, except that he recognized her. He recognized the crescent shape of her left ear, bare now, the ghost of a piercing still visible. He recognized the way she held her shoulders, not slumped, never entirely slumped, even now, even here, with the remnant posture of a woman who had once moved through rooms with quiet authority. He recognized the particular stillness she settled into when she sensed uncertainty nearby, a stillness he had inherited without knowing it. He had spent 22 years searching 2 continents. She had been 4 kilometers from his front gate. The woman's eyes moved to him slowly, the way eyes do when they have learned that the world rarely offers anything worth hurrying toward. They traveled up from his shoes, good shoes. She would have known good shoes, and arrived at his face. Something changed in them, something ancient and dormant and fiercely, painfully alive. Her lips moved before any sound came, then barely above a breath. In a voice eroded by years, but shaped by a memory no amount of hardship had managed to reach. "Is that my little boy?" The question undid him completely. Alaric Virely, who had not wept since he was 11 years old, who had built an empire, specifically, so that nothing in the world could make him feel small again, took 3 steps forward and lowered himself to his knees on the ground beside her. He did not see a homeless woman. He saw her at the kitchen table, humming. He saw her hands braiding, mending, reaching. He saw every version of her his memory had preserved across 2 decades of silence. He took her trembling hands in both of his. He could not speak, not yet, but he did not let go. They brought her home in Alaric's car. Samara sat in the back with Aloan, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough to feel the older woman trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper than cold. Alaric drove. He did not call his driver. He did not make a single phone call. For the entire journey, the only sound was the city moving past the windows and the quiet, unsteady rhythm of a mother relearning how to breathe indoors. Alaric brought her through the private entrance on the north wing, the one even the household staff rarely used. He did not want lights or questions, or the particular cruelty of curious eyes. Samara drew a bath, found a robe, warmed soup that she placed on a tray with the same quiet care she had offered in a rubbish heap, because she understood, instinctively, that dignity was not about the setting, it was about the intention. It took 3 days for Aloan to find her words, not because she was confused, but because she had packed the story down for so long, compacted it so deeply beneath the weight of years, that retrieving it required the kind of effort that exhausted her by the hour. Alaric sat with her each evening. He did not rush her. He simply arrived, settled into the chair beside her bed, and remained, giving her the one thing he had never been able to offer across 22 years of searching: his presence. On the 3rd evening she spoke. His name had been Dorian Voss, a business associate of Alaric's, father from the years before the marriage, a man of considerable local influence who had decided, with the particular arrogance of men who have never been refused, that Aloan's devotion to her young son was an inconvenience to an arrangement he had been quietly engineering. He had not taken her violently. That was the detail that had made it so difficult to trace, so easy to misread. He had taken her through leverage, documents forged against her, a fabricated legal situation, constructed with enough bureaucratic weight to make a young mother believe, in the span of a single devastating afternoon, that disappearing was the only way to keep her son safe from consequences she had not created and could not fight. She had left believing it was an act of protection. She had spent 22 years believing Alaric was safe, successful, that the distance had served its purpose. She had not known he was searching. She had not known he doubted the story. She had not known that he had kept her earring. When Alaric finally spoke, his voice was so measured it cost him visibly. "You left to protect me." Aloan's eyes filled. She nodded once. Across the room, Samara pressed her hand to her mouth and looked at the window, giving them the only gift she had left to offer: privacy and the quiet grace to let them begin. The estate changed before Alaric did. Or perhaps it was simply that, once something begins to thaw, you notice the warmth before you notice the source. Small things first. The kitchen, which had previously operated with the emotional temperature of a laboratory, began producing meals at irregular hours, not because the schedule had been altered, but because Alaric had started appearing in the doorway at odd times, asking quietly what his mother had eaten, whether she had managed to finish it, whether she had asked for anything specific. The staff noticed. They said nothing, but they noticed. He cleared his afternoon calendar for the first time in 11 years. His assistant received the instruction without expression, which was either professionalism or shock. Alaric didn't examine it closely. What mattered was the hour between 2 and 3 each day, which he now spent in the North Wing sitting room, doing something he had no framework for and no vocabulary to describe. He was simply there, present, learning, at 41, what it felt like to sit with another person without an agenda. Aloan was recovering slowly, in the layered way that people recover when the damage is not just physical, rebuilding from the inside out. One quiet day at a time, she slept deeply. She ate carefully. She sometimes looked at her surroundings with an expression that moved between wonder and a sorrow so old it had become structural. On the days she was tired, Alaric read to her. Business journals at first, because they were what he had nearby. Then, after she smiled faintly at a passage about corporate quarterly returns and said, very gently, "Do you have anything with a story in it?" Actual books, ones he ordered that same evening and received the next morning. because that was still one thing his resources were good for. It was during the second week that he knocked on Samara's door. She opened it still in her work clothes, her expression carrying the particular caution of someone who has been waiting for a consequence to arrive. "I'd like you to help coordinate my mother's care," he said, not as additional duties, as a different role entirely. Samara studied him for a moment. Why me? It was a fair question. He had an entire network of qualified professionals he could summon within the hour. "Because she trusts you," he said. "She met you before she met me." He paused, and something moved briefly across his face. Not quite discomfort, not quite gratitude, something that lived in the narrow space between the two. "And because you saw her when it cost you something to see her, that matters." Samara was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. That evening, for the first time, she sat at the table in the North Wing sitting room, not serving, not standing at a respectful distance, but seated, going through care notes with Alaric while Aloan dozed in the chair between them. It felt to everyone in that room like a beginning. Dorian Voss was 73 now, and unwell, living quietly in a coastal property 2 provinces away. Alaric's investigative team had located him within 48 hours. The same team that had spent years searching for Aloan and had simply been looking in the wrong direction. Alaric reviewed the file on a Thursday morning. He read it completely, set it down, and sat for a long time in his office with his hands flat on the desk. Then he called his legal team. What followed was not revenge. It was something that required more patience than revenge, and more precision, and ultimately more power, because destruction is simple, but correction is meticulous work. He began with the documents. The forged legal records that had been constructed 22 years ago to make Aloan's disappearance appear voluntary were buried across 3 municipal archives and a private filing system that no longer officially existed. Alaric's lawyers spent 6 weeks carefully, methodically, legally dismantling every false layer, not through force, but through the kind of sustained, resourced persistence that the original architects of those documents had never anticipated anyone applying. Each fraudulent record was formally challenged. Each challenge was supported by documentation Aloan herself provided in careful, witness testimony that she gave from the sitting room of the North Wing, dressed well for the first time in decades, her voice steady in a way that made the lawyers exchange glances they thought no one noticed. Samara noticed, she always noticed. The official record, when it was finally corrected, was not dramatic. There was no ceremony, no public announcement. A document was amended, a status was changed. The words voluntarily departed were replaced, through proper legal process, with an annotation that acknowledged the falsification of the original report. Alaric had it framed, quietly, and placed on his desk where the folder had once lived, not as a trophy, as a reminder of what had been owed and was now, incompletely but honestly, paid. He also established a trust, not in Aloan's name, she had asked him, with gentle firmness, not to make her into a cause, but in the names of women who had found themselves in circumstances similar to hers, isolated, legally vulnerable, made invisible by people with more resources and less conscience. The trust funded legal advocacy, document restoration, identity recovery. It was staffed by professionals and overseen by a board. Alaric attended the first board meeting and said very little. He was still learning, in most areas of his life, to let other people speak. Aloan asked him one evening what had happened to Dorian Voss. Alaric was quiet for a moment. "Nothing I arranged," he said. "The legal record speaks for itself. What people do with accurate information is their own matter." His mother looked at him for a long time. "You've changed," she said. He considered denying it. Then, simply, yes, he did not make a speech. Samara had half expected one, some formal arrangement, a room full of staff assembled at attention, Alaric at the head of the table, delivering carefully chosen words in his precise, measured way. It would have been in keeping with the version of him she had first known. The man who communicated appreciation the way he communicated everything else. Efficiently, at a controlled distance, with no excess. Instead, he knocked on her door on a Sunday morning when the estate was quiet, and asked if she would walk with him. They went through the east garden, past the roses that bloomed on schedule, along the gravel path toward the far bench where the property opened onto a view of the city below. It was early enough that the light was still soft. Aloan was asleep. The house held its breath around them. Alaric walked with his hands in his pockets, which was new. Small things kept being new about him, in ways Samara had stopped cataloging and simply accepted. He spoke without preamble, without formality, which told her this had cost him something to prepare. "I want to acknowledge what you did," he said, not the outcome of it, not what it led to, or what it meant for me, or for my mother. He paused, the act itself. Samara said nothing. She had learned that he sometimes needed the silence to finish. You fed a hungry woman, he said. That is all you knew you were doing. There was no guarantee of reward, no indication that it would matter beyond the immediate moment. You risked something real, your income, your security, everything you had carefully built. For a person the world had decided was not worth the inconvenience of noticing. He stopped walking. I had spent 22 years and considerable resources trying to find my mother, he said quietly. And a young woman with a cloth bag and a tin bowl did what none of it could. Samara looked at the city below them, because looking at him directly in this moment felt like something neither of them were quite ready for. I didn't know who she was, she said. I know, his voice was low. That's the part that matters. You didn't help her because of what she might be connected to, or what she might be worth to someone. You helped her because she was hungry, and she was alone, and you couldn't walk past that. He paused. Some people can walk past that. I'm not certain I couldn't have before. The admission hung between them, honest and undefended. Samara finally looked at him. There was no performance in his face, no calculation. Just a man standing in a garden he had built around himself like armor, acknowledging, with quiet difficulty, that the most powerful thing that had entered it in 22 years had arrived carrying soup. Thank you, he said, for seeing her. Samara nodded once. She wasn't hard to see, she said gently. They stood together in the early light, and neither of them said anything more. And it was enough. 6 months later, the roses along the east wall bloomed slightly off schedule. Alaric noticed and did not correct it. Eloan had taken, quietly and without announcement, to tending the garden in the late afternoons, not with the help of the groundskeeping staff, though they hovered nearby with the careful attentiveness of people who have been asked to be, available without being intrusive, but alone. With a pair of gloves Samara had found at a market, and a small set of tools she had selected herself, she moved through the beds with the deliberate, unhurried focus of someone reclaiming a language they had not spoken in a long time. She was elegant again, not in the way of before, not restored to some prior version of herself, as though the intervening years were simply an interruption to be smoothed over. She was elegant in a different way now, refined in the original sense of the word. Something passed through fire and made more essentially itself. Her white hair was dressed beautifully. She wore it as a declaration. The strength in her was not the absence of what she had suffered. It was built from it, and it showed. And it was the most quietly remarkable thing Alaric had ever watched happen to another person. He was different in ways that resisted simple description. The 5:15 alarm still sounded. The suits were still precise. The work was still serious, and the expectations of those around him were still high. But there was, in the architecture of his daily life, a new kind of space, unhurried pockets of time that he protected without apology. Morning coffee with his mother, Sunday evenings with no calendar, laughter occasionally, which still surprised the staff when it happened. He laughed more easily than anyone would have predicted. The dinner that evening was not a formal occasion. That had been Samara's one condition when Alaric proposed it. No formality, no occasion-making, no sense that anyone was being celebrated or observed. Just a meal, just people who had found their way, improbably and irrevocably, into each other's lives. Eloan had requested she be allowed to contribute something to the cooking. The kitchen staff had accommodated this, with an enthusiasm that suggested they had been hoping she would ask. When Samara arrived, she came through the front entrance. She had not been asked to come in uniform. She wore her own clothes, a deep green dress that her mother had embroidered along the collar, and she carried a small jar of the spiced preserve she made from a family recipe that Eloan had already, twice, asked for the ingredients of. She sat between them, not at the end of the table, not at a respectful distance, at the center of it in the warm light, at the heart of a family that had been broken by cruelty and quietly, stubbornly reassembled by kindness. Eloan reached across and covered Samara's hand with her own. No one spoke for a moment. They didn't need to. Some things complete themselves in silence, in a shared meal, in a lit room, in the simple, radical act of belonging to one another. Outside, the roses bloomed at their own pace, and inside, for the first time and longer than any of them could properly measure, everything was whole. Some people enter your life like a transaction. Others enter like a correction, quiet, unhurried, arriving exactly when the world has forgotten what it owes. Samara Cade was 26 years old, earning a maid's wage, carrying responsibilities that would have bent a lesser spirit. She had every reason to walk past a woman in a garbage dump and call it someone else's problem. She knelt down instead. That single act of grace did not just reunite a mother and son. It dismantled 22 years of silence. It restored a stolen identity. It transformed a man who had mistaken hardness for strength. It turned an employee into family. It proved what the world keeps trying to make us forget, that ordinary people, in ordinary moments, with nothing but a warm bowl and a willing heart, can rewrite the entire story. Kindness is never small. It only looks that way before it changes everything. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in Samara's quiet courage, in Alohan's endurance, or in Alaric's long road back to himself, then you belong here. AfroKorean Grit Stories exists for the ones who carry more than they show, who give more than they receive, and who refuse, even when it costs them, to look away from another person's pain. Follow, share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their kindness matters. And come back, because the next story is already waiting for you. AfroKorean Grit Stories, where ordinary people do extraordinary things.